right, Michael, you want to get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for coming up with this idea and for inviting the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab to co-sponsor this wonderful event. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm with the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Hopefully some of you that are in the audience have been to some of the events that we have done over the past couple of weeks, but Katie, who is an advisor to the lab, said, you know, this is a great idea. We should do something with Odyssey's audience as well, which is a little bit different, but there is some overlap. And so we're just very happy to have a great variety of people here, practitioners, educators, people that are both sort of in the trenches, as it were, and training the future leaders to talk about their experiences and maybe how we can respond to this in better ways. We're in totally uncharted territory, as we all know. Everyone is sort of making it up as they go with whatever knowledge they have. And so I'm very grateful to be here, that we can build on this foundation and hopefully come to a little bit better understanding of what's happening and how we can make the situation as better as possible. So thank you, Katie, for having me.
Thank you. We are so glad to be partnering with you. So again, my name is Katie Givens Kime. I'm the Director of Religion and Civic Engagement at Odyssey Impact. And this is the first of several live town halls that we at Odyssey Impact are convening for faith leaders in response to COVID-19. Just a tiny bit of context, Odyssey Impact is a multi-faith media nonprofit, and we uplift excellent documentary films as tools for powerful storytelling. We partner with all faith leaders and faith communities, but chaplains have long been of particular importance to Odyssey, given chaplains' rising influence in just what the American religiosity landscape looks like, and also because one of our special strengths is attending to faith leaders healing in the wake of communal trauma and communal anxiety. And that certainly is one phrase, communal anxiety, that could describe what we're going through right now. So that brings us to today's Town Hall webinar. So our esteemed 4 panelists are all chaplaincy practitioners and educators with expertise and lived experience with communal trauma and moral injury, moral anxiety, moral dilemmas in the context of spiritual care. That's a focus of experience and research for all of them. To be clear, we have opened this town hall webinar to all faith leaders. However, to really overhear what's happening with chaplains in healthcare settings, because we really believe that there's quite a lot of relevant overlapping wisdom to be shared. Odyssey sends a huge thanks to one of our most favoritist strong partners, Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. And now, and I'll also just introduce the panelists very briefly. Dr. Stephanie Crumpton is at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. Dr. Carrie Doran is at Iliff School of Theology in Denver. Dr. Zachary Moon is at Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, and Cantor Michael SHOCHET is at Temple Rodef Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia, as well as being a police chaplain. With that, I'm now going to hand it over to CARRIE. The panelists decided that not just talking about spiritual practices of care, but actually doing one was of huge importance as we start our time together.
I'd like to have us begin with just a very simple, relaxing breath. So what we're going to do is just breathe into the count of 4, hold for 5 seconds, and breathe out slowly for 8 seconds. And if you wish, you might want to place your hand on a place in your body where you tend to hold stress. I tend to get shortness of breath when I'm feeling stressed. And so as you take in this deep, relaxing breath, feel the warmth of your hand on that place in your body, and then try to experience the goodness of oxygen. You may wish to close your eyes in order to better focus inwardly on the sensations of your body. So let's take in a deep breath to the count of 4. And hold for about 8 seconds or 7 seconds. And then breathe out slowly. And let's try that one more time. So breathe in, hold, and then breathe out slowly. And I invite you, especially those people at home, to just pay attention to how you experience stress in your body during our conversation. Whenever you experience that sense of life threat that so many of us feel when we talk about coronavirus, you may want to take one of those slow, deep breaths and place your hand just to have a sense of compassion for yourself.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So to kick off our time, the first sort of open question to the panelists is to just share a spiritual practice that's working for you in response to your specific COVID challenges. And Carrie just shared one, but maybe who would like to go first? Michael, SHOCHET, would you like to go first?
Sure. So, for me, I like to focus on resiliency and hope. So 3 ways in which I do this are one, through Jewish texts. So for example, Rabbi Stephen Pierce, who's senior rabbi of Congregation Emmanuel in San Francisco, writes about resilience and how resilience is more than bouncing back after adversity. He says, like scar tissue that is stronger than the healthy tissue it replaces, some individuals discover inner strength and are made stronger by difficult times that enable them to rise and meet even greater challenges. Resilient people, Rabbi Pierce says, face adversity with determination by finding comfort and strength in words that are offered by the psalmist. Psalm 121, I lift my eyes into the hills, from whence comes my help? My help comes from God, maker of heaven and earth. And specifically for me, lately, I've been looking to the Psalm 30, which reminds me that the importance of being hopeful. It says, O Lord my God, I cried to you for help and you have healed me. And then it says, and the lines that to me are so important, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. For me, focusing on that fact that we will get through this is so important, and we should let our faith and our hope sustain us, because as the psalmist says, the day will dawn and joy will come again. And finally, the third is the idea of resilience as a people. So the Jewish people, I'm a synagogue clergy member, the Jewish people have been resilient for thousands of years. And when I focus on that and the rituals and songs and prayers of our people who have been helped in difficult times, it gives me hope and sustenance, nourishing my soul.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, would you mind sharing?
Sure. One of the first things that I'm really focusing on right now is what am I holding in my body and how? Very much like what Carrie introduced us to with the spiritual practices. My spiritual practice, one of them is yoga. I'm a yoga instructor on top of being theologically trained, which is actually pretty helpful because sometimes being theologically trained can keep me in my head, especially when it seems safer for my body to be in my head. But yoga, the practice of breath work and also movement work. Most people think only about the postures of yoga, also known as asana. And they're not as much focusing on what it takes to actually get into one of those postures or to safely get out of them. And the key to that is actually the breath work. So the breathing exercise that Carrie introduced us to, but also there's a space, the breath work also known as pranayama. There's a space in pranayama, and Carrie introduced us to it, where there is a stillness. It's at the end of the exhale, and in between the exhale and the next inhale, there's a space. And it's where you're empty of breath, and there's a stillness that actually happens in the body and also quiets the mind. And so practicing kind of what am I feeling in my body, what am I carrying in my body, and especially as persons who are working on the front line, who are chaplains, they don't have time to stop and not carry. But at the end of the day, or at the end of the visit, they are indeed carrying something. So the importance of a spiritual practice like yoga for me has been to simply say, to check in with myself sometimes 2-3 times a day. What am I carrying? What needs breath? What needs stretching? What is unable to stretch? What is locked up, literally? And one of the primary places where we hold grief and anxiety are actually in our hips and our pelvic girdle. So actually spending a lot of time, and plus a lot of us are also sitting a lot, right? And so we think we're stiff just because we've been sitting or because we've been doing a lot of walking, our feet may hurt. I would also encourage us to consider that may be where we are holding someone else's pain, not just our own. but we're empathic people. This is what we do for a living. Our biggest resource is empathy. And there's a moment in which the transference and countertransference can get overwhelming, and yet it is still in our bodies. So yoga has been incredibly helpful for me. Secondarily, lament. I have realized that lament has been critical. And the big part about lament is that it gives a space to tell the truth. I mean, the ugly truth. It's a space where you can speak the unspeakable, where you can cry where there are no words. It's that you kind of move into a primal place of sound that God does here. And it's also a righteous outrage where we are demanding of a deepening of our relationship with God over the matter of loss and why. So I'd say for me that yoga right now is pretty much holding me together. And also the reality of being able to say, as we will deal with, as some will deal with for Good Friday, my God, rather than seeing that as a no-no that we've often been, challenged. We're not supposed to ask why, we're not supposed to challenge God. I actually experience that as an invitation to go deeper with God. So the two of those have been pretty helpful for me.
Thank you so much. Attending to psyche and soma, so important. And Zach?
Yeah, I've found myself really reflecting on the practice of Sabbath during this time in when I hold devotional space. And what I'm realizing over these weeks has been for the entirety of my life as a person of faith, as a member of a faith community and a tradition, Sabbath has always been greatly spiritualized, right? It's been a certain kind of signpost gesturing in the direction of the need for rest, the need for replenishment, the need to unplug in a sort of, professionally, then I would understand this in terms of some of the imagery that we talk about when we reference things like caring for oneself, right? In the midst of the work of congregational leaders, chaplains, people who are doing care provision of one kind or another, as a way to remind ourselves to check in with our need to care for ourselves. As Stephanie said, as we are continuing to bear the pain, the grief that we may receive from other folks as well. But these weeks have got me thinking really differently about Sabbath. And I realized that as I have allowed Sabbath to be a certain kind of teacher, I have also held Sabbath at arm's length throughout my entire life. And now Sabbath has taken on an almost adversarial kind of a relationship, which is, this is where Sabbath is really the real stuff of practical existence, right? So if Sabbath says, you gotta take a break, well, I'm gonna take a break on my terms, thank you very much. I'm not gonna take a break when somebody else says take a break. I'm gonna take a break when it's suitable to me, when I'm still in control, when I'm the one electing to exert my power and my agency to say, now's the time where I'm going to care for myself. Now's the time that I'm going to unplug. Now's the time where I'm going to say to everybody who cares about me, hey, I'm taking care of myself. Well, this is not a Sabbath like that. This is a Sabbath like that brings you right to the altar of humility and awe. And I don't mean those in gentle, nice ways. In ways that make us feel warm and cozy. When I say adversarial, I mean adversarial. As I feel a loss of power, as I feel a loss of control. But even as I'm feeling this kind of deeply humbled kind of loss around this, I'm also finding my heart opened to, I think, some of the relationships that Sabbath was always designed to bring us closer into balance. And in large part, that has to do with our nearest connections with our families and other people who are immediately close to us. How do we allow some of the other connections or sense of our identity that has to do with our own individual control and our own individual value through productivity? How instead are those removed, and what is left to take on the primacy that it really deserves are our most immediate relationships. And then secondly, but of no less importance, is our relationship in an order of ecological creation, that we are not masters of this earth. We are not masters of this universe. We are meant to be co-inhabitors of this world and this space. And that I find myself often wanting to have my devotional space as near to nature as possible during this time, whether it's sitting by the window or when it's possible to take a walk through my neighborhood, and just listening to how so much of the noises of our going about and our getting from here to there have been removed from the sensory scape of things. And I hear the natural world singing at a volume I've never heard it before, hearing the birds in the forest near my house, hearing the way, nearly the way in which the spring flowers are beginning to come up from the soil, and really wanting to give that a kind of centrality, even as I carry a sense of grief and loss at all of the loss that is happening around me and immediately in my life, allowing also for that loss to be a kind of opening and a kind of giving of space to be in what I would know to be right relationship with a kind of ecological created order.
Thank you all so much. That's such honest and candid sharing about just what's really working and what can really work for us in times like this. I know, for me, I find myself just a little bit on the edge of tears about either moments of joy or pain and grief. And I even watching the chat come up and someone welcomed themselves from my hometown, Kalamazoo, and a spiritual care provider there. And it's so real and unfolding what's happening for all of us. So just as a next movement in the conversation, just thinking about what tools from our general training in pastoral care and chaplaincy, what tools, and for everyone it's a little bit different. I'm not going to pretend that there's some uniformity or universality that is not there, but what from our training seems of particular help at this time, and maybe even what cognitive frameworks help you integrate and make meaning and just keep yourself functional right now?
I'll start if you'd like.
Okay, sure.
One of the things that maybe makes me a little bit different from some of the other panelists who are professors and work in hospital chaplaincy is that I am a police chaplain. I supervise a group of chaplains here in Fairfax County, Virginia, for Fairfax County Police Department, and also community chaplains who respond to help community members in need when they're undergoing communal trauma or personal trauma. And so I would like to think about the toolbox, the tools in my toolbox that bring hope and presence for people who are first responders. And I see in some of the chat messages that we do have first responder chaplains on the line. So, ministry of presence is so important now more than ever, even with social distancing. So we still have to be there for these people, even if we can't be there in person. So it's so important to stay connected by touching base with them via phone, email, teleconference, text message, whatever works. I've been trying to do that with our police officers in my area who are so stressed at the moment. I want them to know that I'm there and supporting them now more than ever. And it's about really listening and hearing their challenges. One of the things that I think about is that physical distancing or social distancing is so crucial from a public health perspective, but it can be so unhealthy from an emotional or spiritual perspective because we tend to worry more when we're alone. Worry and fear build when we can't connect with others. I was reading a Washington Post columnist who wrote an article recently who said, "The space between ticks of the clock seem especially long right now." So, of course, for introverted people, this is a gift, but not so much for the extroverted among us. So mindfulness exercises, which some of our panelists might talk about today, can help calm us during those silent or filled or worried places. It can allow us to be more rational and objective instead of fearful and irrational. Of course, for those who connect to their faith and God's role in their lives, the stillness can offer us a spiritual comfort My tradition teaches us that God's presence isn't always in the thunder and lightning, but it's also in the still small voice. And Michael Gerson writes that if we truly listen, we can hear the voice of reassurance that speaks in the silence.
Thank you. Carrie, would you be willing to share?
Yeah, I think an image I've found helpful lately is the idea of a stress fingerprint. So the more I'm able to practice that deep breathing and be aware of how I experience stress in my body, the more I realize that my stress responses are very much shaped by my formative experiences, my past experiences. So having a sense of compassion for myself, but then also there's a lot of research that we tend to ruminate on the most difficult moments in the day, that our brains are wired that way. So I've been trying to catch myself when I start doing that. And I think it has to do with moral stress, because I ruminate on the moments when I'm most morally stressed because I'm so formed to care for others. And so when I can catch myself in those moments, I try to consciously retrieve a good moment in the day when I connected with someone. Like, just even reading all the comments coming in now, I have this image of the web of life that we're all part of, that
Absolutely.
everybody on this call is here because they have vocations of care and they're trying to protect life. But that also makes us very vulnerable to moral stress. So connecting in a web like this, we're constantly knitting together a web that holds us. And those are some of the images I try to hold on to.
Thank you. That's so helpful. Stephanie?
So I think what is helping me is my research and framework around trauma, right? This is a traumatic experience on multiple levels. And it's collective trauma, it's individual trauma, and it's also triggering. And one of the most significant things that I've noticed about trauma is how trauma impacts how we experience time. Time either gets slowed down when we numb out, or time accelerates, right? When we are hyper vigilant, hyper engaged. And so one of the things that I think is important is for us to just kind of notice, like literally, sometimes it might be helpful to just check in. What time of the day is it? Where am I? What day is it? Literally. And another part of it, so there's the reality of keeping actual time, chronos time. But I think what is also important for me is also recognizing that as care providers, we are in this moment, but this moment is part of a long history of care providers who have been doing work in times of crisis. And I think that that's significant for us to recognize that we are joining a trajectory. If we think back as far as difficult times have been happening to humanity, there have been those who are now our ancestral kind of guides, right? That they've been there. We can access their wisdom. We read their words in our, in our toolkits and our research. But there's also part of us that we're drawn into this work because there's something in us that is inclined to heal, right? And that something, I think, is transgenerational. And so what I think has been helpful to me, especially when it's particularly, because I've already talked about how I'm committed to lament, right? Now, in lament, you can dig yourself into your own well with that lament now, especially if you have issues with anxiety and depression, as I have. Tricky. So I think what has been important for me is to recognize that I am part of a legacy of healers. We are part of a legacy of healers. They have made it through. There's something in us that has the answer on how to get through the moral dilemmas of having to make difficult decisions about who's going to get care and who isn't going to get care. And at the same time, take care of ourselves. And I think one of the things that also is helpful to notice that there's a past. We're clearly in it right now in the present, but also to think about a future. A pandemic that involves death has the capacity to break off the possibility of a future. But the reality is, some people are going to die and are dying, but not everybody. And what can we do to honor the legacy of those who are transitioning in this time? So to think about a future. And for me, because I'm action oriented, one of the things that's helping me is to think about what is happening that has caused pain and struggle and is not right. And how can I now add that to some sort of a, my own personal advocacy agenda? How can I join a movement moving forward such that what is happening that is not right can be righted for the next generation? Because there will be another crisis, right? This is what the reality of life and life cycles are. But for me to think, A, what day and what time is it? B, that I occur in an ancestral legacy of healers. C, stuff is going way wrong right now on systemic and personal levels, as well as just the grief. So to be thinking about, what can I think about and how can I start planting seeds now? And part of resilience is the ability to act against what has been done, right? And so some things, the systemic challenges when people have to make decisions about who gets to be on a ventilator, who doesn't, who gets to be seen or when and who doesn't, right? And not because we don't want to go see them, but because there simply aren't enough people to be there when people are actually dying. So people are dying alone. The question becomes, as we move through this, and we are going to get on the other side of this, what kind of systemic movements can I participate in so that we can increase the amount of people who are able to be there, so that we can have the kind of economic and political systems so that we don't have to make these kinds of moral choices amidst the reality of a pandemic that is ending life.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. That transitioned us really well to our next topic. But Zach, did we still want to hear from you on this one?
Sure. Yeah. No.
Yeah, please.
I think some of the pieces that I would just add to what has already been shared here is it's been helpful for me to think about what needs to be acknowledged. I mean, for all of us, kind of collectively as a part of this society. That when we talk about moral dilemmas, the distress or moral injury that people are experiencing already and will experience during this pandemic, the word moral, we have to immediately be connecting to the fact that this is not just something that we experience as individuals, but that there is this collective or social relational dimensionality to what we're talking about here, right? None of us just has their own freestanding morals, but morals are something that are socially negotiated and relationally constructed and relationally adjusted over time, right? So here we are in a time where collectively, in a way that is unprecedented for any of us, there is a general traumatic level stressor that is bombarding all of us. Not in the same ways as CARRIE said, right? We all have a unique stress fingerprint, right? So keep that a hold of us. As Stephanie said, we're not the first and we're not going to be the last in a long intergenerational and transgenerational relationality that's happening here, right? So we're both unique and we're also connected across time in these ways. But we're also in a horizontal sense connected to each other in a very significant way. So the stress that we're experiencing is bringing all of this to the surface. And one of the things that I think is crucial for us to acknowledge then in this moment is we were not prepared for this, right? And it's, I think as we acknowledge that, many of us immediately go to the place of looking to assign blame. Who was responsible for having us be prepared, and then they did not prepare us in this kind of way. And therefore what we feel is frustration, what we feel is anger, what we feel is contempt, or what we feel is disgust for these people who were designated to be in these roles of authority and ultimate responsibility for preparing us for these times. And I don't need to point you to any of the commentary to know exactly who and what and how I'm talking about this. But this is a moral reaction, right? There are some in our society assigned to have this authority and are responsible to practice that authority responsibly. The failure to do so, it is a natural and appropriate thing for us to feel rage and anger and contempt about the absence of that and the lack of that that's happening.
Yeah,
There's also some moral emotions that are going to surface to us when we think about our own experience, whether we're serving on the front lines as first responders, as care providers, really meeting this crisis head on, or for many more of us who are further back from those front lines, but who are also experiencing moral distress around our own bystanderness, our own sense of how are my life choices either helping to protect or potentially threats of harm that we do not intend and yet also may be perpetuating or participating in a not entirely willful way. There's immense moral dimensionality for us as well happening around this. And it's clear to me, as much as I've seen some folks wanting to use military or war language to describe this, that one of the ways in which this is immediately not like being in the military is the military prepares you to inhabit and function in an entirely different moral world.
Yeah.
Okay? None of us had the basic training. None of us went to boot camp to get ready to be alive in this moral world that the pandemic has generated for us. And I think it's crucial for us to acknowledge that, because we may in fact be doing harm to ourselves in our thinking, in our feeling, in our bodies, in looking around, recognizing the unfamiliarity, recognizing the overwhelm. Can we take a moment to say, none of us were prepared for this in that kind of way? And that has everything to do with what Stephanie refers to as the dynamics of what is traumatic about this. Is all that is normal and familiar to us is being overwhelmed. That's not a shortcoming or deficit on any of our parts. We were not prepared for this moment as it is. So what we're needing to do then is turn our connections to one another, even as they are being separated from each other. We're feeling that sense of separation. It's important for us to be able to do what we can to reach out to each other and to feel those connections, whether it's through our spiritual practices or through our social relational support networks. Those are crucial now more than ever.
Thank you so much for that, Zachary. And I think, you know, when we as panelists were talking about this issue of moral injury and whether it's an applicable term, I mean, because moral injury has been used in a different context. We haven't had a pandemic context like this before. But CARRIE, you had some interesting insights just about the usefulness or the range which we can think about this moral injury. And I just want to put in one more thing. There was this amazing New Yorker cover like 3 weeks ago. Do you know the one I'm talking about? It had a person with like arrays of dominoes coming out, and it illustrated this morality or these series of choices where we feel like we have a heightened sense of how our personal choices affect others. And that's, you know, been a big topic in all conversations talking about the pandemic, but specifically for those providing spiritual and pastoral care, it's of great interest. So CARRIE, what do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I see the trauma research is helpful right now because we're all experiencing acute stress response to the coronavirus, which over time, acute stress without social support and helpful coping becomes post-traumatic stress. And I'd like to think of moral stress the same way. We're experiencing acute moral stress in response to the life threat and the compromising of our core humanitarian value of do no harm. Over time, this acute moral stress could become moral injury, which is parallel to post-traumatic stress, that sort of lasting re-experiencing. There's some research indicating that spiritual, religious, and moral struggles, like struggles with a God experienced as judging, struggles with religious authorities experienced as judging, struggles with being shunned by one's community of faith, or struggles with moral questions and doubt, that if you're experiencing a heightened sense of those kind of struggles and they become chronic, that is going to make it more likely that you'll experience post-traumatic stress, and we would imagine moral injuries. So this speaks to the key role of spiritual caregivers right now, because if we can provide a space and find that space for ourselves to use spiritual practices that connect us with goodness and self-compassion, then we're likely to come through this. We will have experienced transitory acute stress, maybe transitory trauma and struggles, but they won't become chronic, which is where you get that lasting harmful impact of acute stress and acute moral injury.
Thank you so much. Stephanie?
I think I agree with what Carrie's saying. And as I was listening to her, one thing I think is important for us to acknowledge is that for many people, this traumatic event is now descending upon and settling on pre-existing traumatic experiences, right? Many of which have been unaddressed. So we have compound, complex trauma and grief. There have not been enough opportunities for individuals and communities to do the kind of collective grieving that is required to keep us from being in the places of moral stress, prolonged moral stress that Carrie's talking about, right? So I think it's pretty important for us to think about that this is descending upon existing moral stress, existing post-traumatic or ongoing traumatic experiences. And so I think it's important for care providers to, in some ways, cut themselves some slack, because this is a lot. And if it's not a lot, and so when I say a lot, I think it's important to recognize personally, it may be a lot, but if you have not individually or been a part of a community that has experienced prolonged, protracted moral stress and traumatic stress, you can now be drafted into that community because of vicarious traumatization, right? And so you might not be the one who's immediately experiencing it, but the importance of recognizing if something suddenly becomes very odd, you find yourself odd to yourself, you find yourself strange, you find God also strange, right? It's important in terms of our theological or in terms of our clinical framework to bring our clinical framework of the awareness that this is a problem that is sitting on top of several unresolved transgenerational problems, right? And that there's a systemic component to it, to think about that. And then to also put on top of that theologically, right? That God is strange right now. This is a different kind of God than a lot of people have experienced. This is the first time our generation has been through a pandemic. We've not seen a God of a pandemic before. But the God of the pandemic, right, is also sitting on top of the legacy of other communities that are currently experiencing absence of God, questioning of God. So I think it's really important for us to think about that what is happening now is sitting and triggering, right, especially as we're hearing information about disparity in terms of who's dying from the illness now. Here in Chicago, we're learning that 70% of the deaths here in Chicago were African American, right? And so that's a systemic thing. And so there is moral stress, right, around systemic injustice, which eventually becomes theological. Why this group? Why all of us now in general? What are you doing, God? And then also, now we got to deal with some people are catching it worse than others, and the moral stress that's involved with dealing with that, I think is important. Those are important frameworks for us to think about as we're doing care, to recognize it's multi-layered and it's strange. right? God becomes strange in times like this, and to accept the strangeness of God. There's not I feel judgmental when I say this, so forgive me. Maybe I'll speak to myself. There's not a good time for me to like not accept that God is strange. I feel like it's better for me to be like, you're strange right now, God. You're not who I knew you to be before. You're not where I knew you were before.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to be strange together right now. And so we in this. We're here. This is where we are. Yeah.
Yep, we here, we in it. Like that.
Yeah. Not we are here.
For
We're
me.
here.
Yeah.
There's no we
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Michael Shockett, do you, from moral injury in the framework of police chaplains has meant an entirely different thing. How do you feel like it's an applicable tool from the chaplaincy pastoral care toolkit, and how not for this time we're in?
Sure. Well, up until this crisis, when I think of first responders suffering from moral stress, I focused primarily on when they're faced with taking a life. Having had firsthand experience as a police officer in the inner city of Baltimore, I can say that if I needed to stop a threat, I would have, even if it went against my moral beliefs to hurt or kill someone. And at one point on the street, I had to make that decision when a gunman opened fire on my squad of officers. I wasn't able to return fire at the time, but not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't see the shooter. But I know that if the shooter was in my line of fire, I would have stopped the threat. So up until now, I could easily identify times when an officer might be under moral stress. But if first responders have to take a life or cannot save a gravely injured person or a sick person at the scene of a crisis, they may feel like failures. So as a result, they may blame themselves and experience feelings of guilt, frustration, and shame. But different first responders may have different reactions to the same traumatic event because it's based on how they connect to their own personal values. So moral injury, in my opinion, can occur in situations that, although not traumatic per se, may cause first responders to question their decision-making or their ability to prevent what happens in the line of duty. In the case of the COVID-19 virus, officers who are responding to a life-threatening event may question whether they will catch the virus from someone who they're fighting with, or even stopping on a car stop. They're supposed to stop criminal behavior, but until now they felt protected by their body armor or their weapons or their ability to use lethal or less lethal force. However, now they might see themselves going into a situation unprotected to the virus, which they cannot see and don't know who has. They may question at what point do their values of saving their own life conflict with their professional responsibilities of making sure people don't hurt themselves or others. And this can compromise an officer's performance in the line of duty. I'm sure this causes inner conflict in this pandemic time and could be a moral stress event. In addition, one of the other areas for I see possibly creating moral stress or moral injury in first responders is lack of trust in their leaders to protect them, anxiety at being exposed to the virus, which could cause them to lose faith and meaning in their jobs. So one of my roles as a chaplain is to help first responders see the importance of what they're doing, to help them examine self-forgiveness and gratitude and restore their sense of purpose and meaning in life, staying connected with these people.
Just a follow-up question for you, Michael, because from our Odyssey's Healing the Healers series, which focused on healing in the wake of violent trauma, and both you and Stephanie were involved in that project. And you, as one who was a first responder, as a police chaplain to the Pentagon on 9/11, a lot of conversation in these circles has been, okay, so what insights from other collective traumas are helpful now? So as someone who provided care in the wake of a collective trauma like 9/11, to what extent do you feel like there's some analogous wisdoms or insights for now?
Well, for me, it goes all back to the idea of finding hope and knowing that we've gotten through these communal traumas before. So whether it's, the Las Vegas shooting or 9/11 or something like that, we've seen people grow stronger through the resilience they brought to that incident, that event. And so we've seen people respond well after that. And so we assume that we're also going to do the same in this case. And from a Jewish historical perspective too, right, we're approaching the holiday of Passover this week, which is a big story of resilience and how the Jewish people then found joy at the end of the story.
Yeah, great. I'm looking just at this rich feed of questions from folks, and of course the chat link. So I want to uplift at least one of those really briefly, and also say that it's again uplift that it's been such a joy for Odyssey Impact and Chaplaincy Innovation Lab to work together on resources for this. So whether it's thinking about specific ritual tools, thinking about the specific issues and problems that come up for spiritual caregivers in COVID-19. We are excited to be coming out with more resources, video, town halls, other things together with Chaplaincy Innovation Lab and for congregational leaders as well. So if your questions weren't answered here, we hope that through these two channels, there'll be more. One thing just to deal with directly, it came up in one of the questions from the audience here. Are any of you dealing with ethical questions of the allocation of scarce resources, fewer ventilators for patients that need them, et cetera? And we've alluded to a little bit of that, but one thing in designing this webinar we talked about is that when care is denied for a patient, it affects everyone, right? It affects the provider, it affects the nurses and other medical staff who have to carry out that order. It affects the patient who receives the care, knowing possibly or for sure that someone else didn't get it. And of course, it affects the person denied care. And then for congregational leaders, there is a ripple effect in a community of how, as many of you as panelists have lifted up, outrage and something deep in our sense of morality, ethics, our theologies that feels violated, and those inner compasses of the care providers as well. So any last thoughts about how, and you can even expand it to congregational leaders as well, how faith leaders can respond to all the folks affected when some are denied care? And I'll let any of you pitch in on that.
I could be helpful to think of a moral and religious and spiritual orientation of limits. I was talking to a hospice caregiver who said, whenever death comes, we want to be able to put off death for as long as we can, but we've all experienced limits to that. We're all finite. I think the anguish right now is that people are having to make decisions about who has access to care and who doesn't. In reality, those kind of decisions have always been made. So I could be helpful to just think for a moment about our finitude and the limits that we all live under. That's not to say we shouldn't lament and rage against the ways in which those decisions might be made unfairly.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say this is a good time for you to take some inventory on your theology of suffering and your theology of death. Stephanie pointed us in the direction to be thinking about all of the theological questions that are surfacing with our theologies of God. But to me, this is something that I think is crucial for chaplains to be proficient in. And there's something intersubjective that needs to happen with that knowledge. There needs to be both an inwardly directed reflection, one that considers who you are, where you're coming from, what your tradition speaks about these things. And then there also needs to be a kind of resolved readiness of expectation that the people that you're providing care for may be bringing all kinds of other theological ideas and beliefs into that conversation. So to not impose your theological norms onto somebody else. And that might sound like basics. And again, for chaplains who are often working with people in crisis, I know you would be familiar with this, but I just want to acknowledge it as a way to say, y'all, our theologies of suffering are being tested in a big way, right? The kind of central, crucial question the way we frame it sometimes in non-theological speak is, why is a bad thing happening to a good person, right? We seem to assume that if you lead a good and upstanding life, that things are going to work out for you. And we, in fact, are often so in love with the idea that things are all going to be redeemed, that we go to see movies on the big screen, where, whether it's a superhero movie or something else, that gives us a whole lot of this redemptive suffering narrative again and again and again. There's, the good ones are going to get knocked down by the bad ones, but ultimately the good ones are going to win the day. They're going to find a way they got to band together, and the victory is going to be theirs. This suffering that we're dealing with right now may not follow that script. And I think we need to be prepared, both to the extent that we ourselves are carriers of that theology, that we may be conveyors of that theology, saying to somebody, you're suffering, but it's going to be okay. There may be a whole long time of it not being okay before it ever resembles anything like being okay. And like other panelists have spoken to, and I would certainly echo, folks are dying, and more folks are going to die. This is a heartbreaking thing to sit with when we recognize the kind of scope or scale of suffering and death that we're talking about here. It's the kind of stuff that most of us are kind of wired to try to avoid as much as possible, including coming up with all kinds of dexterous theologies to sort of make sense of in these ways. This may be a good time to not only check in with yourself, but check in with some of your accountability partners in practice, to really sort through some of these questions, because whether it's coming out or coming up to the surface in a care encounter that you might be having, or coming to the surface for yourself in your own reflective process, or whether or not it's kind of hovering in the shadows or in the silence of your practice and of your living during this time, these theologies are hugely influential in what's happening with our experience of stress, and maybe most formatively when it comes to making meaning of what's happening for ourselves in this time.
Incredibly helpful. Just as a last question, I'm reading just both the chats and seeing the Q&As come in. So perhaps one way to end is to, we've named practices, we've named cognitive frameworks, we've named questions that are helping in this time. And also maybe let's just think about a book, if there is a book that's particularly of interest or helpful to you in this time. I'll let you think about that while I answer my own question. So I will say that I found in specifically for book titles that grapple with theologies of suffering and death, it's my old standbys, and I'll just confess right here and tell you that it's Pema Chodron and Richard Rohr are my two favorites. So I found myself not going back to, or not searching out new ones, though maybe I'm just naming me personally, but it's my tried and true, help me ground tools that have been helpful. And any just quick answers from the rest of you?
I'd recommend Larry Graham's book on moral injury. It's easily available. Larry Kent Graham. You can find it on Amazon.
There's a book called Wisdom of the Word Love. It's an older book. It's an edited volume. And in particular, there is an essay by Howard Thurman, and it's called Love of Self. And he talks about the importance of finding one's self fact, especially when there's a change, right? And that if we can't accept how we've been changed by an event or an experience, we are lugging our parts of our severed appendages around with us, as opposed to accepting the change, embracing the change, wrestling with the change. It's better to wrestle with the change than to ignore it. And to wrestle towards a love that is accepting of who we are becoming as we are being changed by this. And so I think that that's a helpful one, Wisdom of the Word Love. And also, quite honestly, Basil van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score.
Nice.
There's some articles on resilience and hope that I think that Katie, I sent to you, and you're going to post that
Yep.
I think are well worth it. But a tried and true book that is old now, but I hope everyone knows about, and it's short, easy to read. When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner. Just very helpful, trying to put sense into some of this stuff.
Excellent.
Octavia Butler would be my recommendation.
Excellent. I just started reading her novel. That's of the spirit, isn't it? Well, friends, I want to thank you. I want to be respectful of our time and thank you so sincerely. A couple of follow-up things. We can quite easily send to all attendees one single email that lists book recommendations and articles we're uplifting. We'll also be doing that on Chaplaincy Innovation Lab is doing that, and Odyssey Impact is doing that. Want to uplift that coming up will be further conversations in some form about moral injury, about spiritual care in this time, and also specifically about domestic violence in this time and how spiritual caregivers can play a role in that. That was already on Odyssey's docket to be creating a Healing the Healers series, and now it is suddenly of enormous importance. Michael Skaggs, any last words to close us out, or?
I'll just echo your thanks for the panel. This has been wonderful. It's just a little bit different take on this conversation than that the lab has been fostering over the past couple of weeks, and so I very much appreciate kind of seeing this side of things, as it were. Your personal reflections are just so meaningful and impactful, and I think that it's important to name and to note that even the experts that we look to, all of you, you're living through this too. We're all trying to find a way through it together. And so thank you for your honesty and your openness, but also for your expertise.
All right, thank you all. Until we cross paths again, and knowing that we are all held in a web together, let's go in peace from this place.